Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Janelle Monae record, The Age of Pleasure. There aren't very many artists, if really any artists, in the mainstream conscience that are quite as consistently unpredictable as Janelle Monae can be in her better moments. It could certainly be argued that her creative peak, so to speak, has since come to pass with the release of widely popular and critically adored records like the ArchAndroid, but generally speaking, she still maintains a pretty major presence in the music industry at large, and her name still pops up pretty much everywhere you go, no matter what kind of musical or even semi-musical space you end up in. The Age of Pleasure, unsurprising to many longtime fans of Monae, seemed to mark another aesthetic change for her, both musically and even publicly, as the weeks that led up to the album's release saw her really put aside a lot of the more hyper-futuristic aesthetics that still remained after her more pop-oriented record Dirty Computer, her last studio album, to go even more into a contemporary direction. Although this basically immediately alienated a lot of fans that initially swarmed around her because they found her brand of artsy, pop, R&B, futuristic, sci-fi, whatever you want to call it, kind of brand the most pleasing thing ever in the mainstream of pop music because it was unique and experimental and distinct, it also did manage to stake a new sound for Janelle Monae, something that actually managed to feel just as confident, at least at first, as anything else she had ever done up to that point. While it may be a slight change, The Age of Pleasure is proof that not all changes are inherently bad, and plus it's not even that much of a 180 really anyways. My point is that changes are generally not a bad thing, even if they do at times result in some slightly weaker work, as will be found here. I promise I'm not saying the album's bad. I like the album, just hear me out, please. The Age of Pleasure certainly takes a step in the less experimental and aesthetically out there way to really go into something, again, a lot more contemporary and a lot more normal, so to speak, by her standards, and ultimately that means that The Age of Pleasure will probably be not nearly as appealing to diehard music nerds who think that circle jerking to the latest effort from Godspeed You Black Emperor is the peak of living, but at the same time, it will probably be more appealing to people who generally don't really like to connect critical thinking with the music that they consume. And I know that sounds pretentious, but I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that this record is average by Monae's standards. Not to say the music itself is average or bad, it's quite good. It's just that it feels a bit more applicable to a wider commercial audience, and that's saying something considering she's already a hugely commercially successful artist. I mean, one could certainly make the argument that some of the tropical, loose, summery vibes that are found here, as well as a pretty stacked track list, which I will get to in a few moments, are qualities that manage to kind of give this an edge to really set it apart from a lot of its peers, and you know what, if you want to make that argument, then go for it. I will not argue against you about that. But at the same time, The Age of Pleasure, at its core, is just meant to be lighthearted fun, and I think Monae knows that throughout the entire record. I mean, you have songs here like Lipstick Lover, for example, that aren't meant to really turn the world of a progressive pop fan upside down or anything like that. They're just meant to be catchy, energetic songs that happen to have hugely romantic overtones that, although they've been in Monae's music since the start really, are really pushed to the front here, and ultimately I think it's a successful move. Considering she's widely known as a fairly idiosyncratic artist, even by weirdo pop star standards, Janelle Monae could have easily tried to make this some sort of conceptual, complex album to pander to the critics, as well as some of her fans that would expect her to stay in that particular lane, but she didn't. And making a fun, lighthearted pop album, she didn't try to make it feel like something it wasn't. She knew what she wanted to do, and she did it. And ultimately, you can hear that in the music. It's executed perfectly because it's not trying to be an album like the ArchAndroid or the Electric Lady. It's just trying to be The Age of Pleasure, and that's exactly what it turns out to be. It has its own identity, and while some people may not like that identity as much as the identities of other Monae records, it's its own identity all the same. Now, admittedly, there are a few weaker points here and there throughout the record, namely in the unnecessarily brief tracks, like the less than 2 minutes long Paid in Pleasure, which just may as well not exist considering how little impact it has on the record as a whole. And if it were a longer and more consistently fantastic album, I would probably say that it's not really worth docking any points because of a couple of short, brief, harmless, and pretty mindless tracks. But The thing is, the record runs for roughly a solid 32 minutes, and that's a pretty brief runtime in and of itself, so to have even a couple of songs that are less than 2 minutes long that don't really add up to much, it still weighs down the listening experience as a whole, which is a shame. I just really wish this record were longer and more consistently solid. Generally speaking, however, Janelle Monae manages to really take up these breezy summertime sounds without a hitch, and it's great to see. She executes the sounds very well, she doesn't try to turn it into something that it's not, and although there are those couple of dips that do ultimately affect the entire album from front to back, the general overall quality of it, it still manages to not really be that bad of a maneuver, those couple of songs here and there that manage to weigh things down on an otherwise strong record. It should always be made clear as well that, like basically anything else that she's ever put together and released to the public for consumption, the entirety of the Age of Pleasure and its best highlight moments are completely defined by Janelle Monae herself. No one else, just her. Monae is just a ridiculously charismatic performer, and there's no getting around that, so taking her and putting her into a musical setting that requires a massive amount of confidence from the performer themselves, it's a great move, because that's something that she's shown time and time again, confidence. She has a great track record for that throughout her entire career up to this point as a performer. Really, this is the best option for her, because while a number of experimental pop musicians could go in a more summery, vibes-based direction and not really work out in that particular setting, she's almost built for it. I mean, whether she's doing a futuristic funk album, or maybe a more complex concept album, or just something as simple as this record, The Age of Pleasure, Janelle Monae is a phenomenal performer. She really manages to have a super colorful personality that bleeds into practically every single line that she sings, and even the instrumentals, which still have her presence in this odd, inexplicable sort of way. She really is a fantastic performer, and maybe someone who goes a little underappreciated from the perspective of just a public figure. I mean, some of the grandiose yet likable songs here, some of the best songs on the record, like Champagne Shit, for example, are completely defined by Monae herself. The instrumentation is great as well, don't get me wrong, but her performance work is just out of this world, generally speaking. She's an incredibly gripping performer that basically demands your attention every second that she's active on the album. Even some of the lesser cuts, like Waterslide, for example, are still solid songs. They may be lesser in the context of the album, but nonetheless, they're still decent, primarily because of Janelle Monae herself. She really does have this dominant demeanor when she is behind the mic, and ultimately, that really requires a lot of effort, and that's exactly what she puts in, a lot of effort, that ultimately makes her someone who is still pretty powerful as a performer, even when she's backed up by not as great instrumentals. And I'm not going to pretend that Monae's performance work is 24/7, 365, the selling point of all of her music, because that would just outright be a lie. I mean, albums like the previously mentioned Electric Lady and ArchAndroid are also very appealing to people for a variety of reasons, ranging from phenomenal and distinct instrumentation, great production, interesting concepts, whether that be aesthetically or in terms of story. There are a variety of things that make Janelle Monae such an appealing artist, but on a record like this, where things are just a bit more stripped back and made a bit more simplistic compared to the complexities of those aforementioned previous records in her discography, it really just does show that Janelle Monae's magnetism as an individual behind the microphone is pretty fantastic, even when it's placed into a context that feels less grandiose and lush in nature. There was, however, an opportunity for the Age of Pleasure to expand that greatness far beyond Monae herself, and it just unfortunately was not taken. The majority of her releases up to this point have been rightfully hugely praised for having excellent features from a variety of artists, features that can become so iconic that they often become just as canonical, if not more so, for an outsider artist's discography than some of their actual original studio releases. For example, one of the most noteworthy things that Big Boy has done post-Outkast is be featured on the song Tightrope. One of the most iconic things that Erykah Badu has done since post-Mama's Gun era has been being featured on Queen, etc., etc. The list really goes on. There are a number of features from massive figures in the music industry that really feel like some of the most important things that they've ever done in an odd kind of way. It doesn't feel right, but it is. I mean, Monae has worked from indie icons like Of Montreal to just straight-up legends like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, and she was even mentored by Prince. And Well, I don't know if you know this, but Prince is a pretty popular guy. So generally speaking, there's a bit of a legacy to live up to here of having great features from great artists of both new and old eras. And admittedly, this record does try to keep up that. It legitimately does. I won't say that it doesn't. The feature list of Monáe's latest studio album once again has a lot of really legendary artists featured on it, but unfortunately, the tragic thing is just that they are virtually never used to their fullest and in turn best extent that they could be. For example, the artsy funk disco icon Grace Jones, as well as the incredibly influential dancehall artist Sister Nancy, are both featured here on Ooh La La and the French 75, respectively, but both of their appearances are so unimpactful and uneventful that you could erase them from the record completely, and their lack of presence would be largely unnoticed by everyone, except the incredibly keen-eared. There's also Sean Kuti, the son of the master of Afrobeat virtually, Fela Kuti, and Sean Kuti's backing band, the Egypt 80. They appear on two different tracks here, Float and No Better, and although they provide some solid work, they also don't provide the raw energy that one would really hope them to. The features that are sprinkled throughout the Age of Pleasure genuinely did have the potential to equal the greatness of the feature lists found on previous Janelle Monae records. I mean, even without some sort of massive name being tacked on here like Prince, it really does feel like you have some of the most influential artists of their kind being found right here in one place, but unfortunately they're just so underutilized that their presence or lack thereof is disappointing to say the least. It doesn't weigh down the listening experience because, well, frankly, they just practically aren't there, but at the same time, it feels like this album could have maybe been so much more if they just were there. The Age of Pleasure will most likely be seen as a failure of massive proportions by some, and in a way, it's not necessarily hard to see why this viewpoint would ever come about. After all, Janelle Monae's career up to this point has largely banked on very forward-thinking and complicated sounds that have made her such a unique figure in modern pop that she's arguably a contemporary example of other classic artists of the same vein within pop music, such as Madonna or even none other than her late mentor Prince. Monáe, in her past, has been somewhat of a puzzling and downright enigmatic figure, and this record just removes that. It removes the shroud from her entirely. And that's not to say that she's been some sort of widely secretive figure or anything like that. She's pretty casual in general, but nonetheless, it feels like musically this is removing part of the identity that really sold a lot of people on her, and while some people, including myself, will really heavily enjoy it, it's understandable that a lot of people won't. As far as the Age of Pleasure goes, those that enjoy it will most likely see it as a step into a different lane for Monáe that manages to be significantly more laid back in terms of its own conceptuality, but still just as punchy as ever. At least that's the way that I personally see it. While the permanence or transience of this new sound that Monáe is picking up on this record is yet to be seen, and, well, to be totally honest, based on her release schedule, probably won't be really seen for quite a while, nonetheless, The Age of Pleasure still feels like a pretty sturdy album, and one that is heavily enjoyable as long as you don't really take on the fact that this feels less complex than her past releases. That's just not important. This record is a different beast entirely, and it's a beast with flaws all the same, but nonetheless, if you take it for what it's for, it's actually a very, very good record, and one that I enjoy greatly. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.